Let's start with something honest because you clicked on this title for a real reason, and I'm not going to pretend that reason doesn't exist. Somewhere in you, after everything you went through, there's a part that wants them to feel it, not because you're cruel, because it's human. When someone causes you real, lasting harm and walks away seemingly untouched by it, something in you rightfully rebels against that unfairness. You're not wrong for wanting that. What I want to give you today is the actual, honest truth about what genuinely reaches a narcissist psychologically, because it's almost never what you'd expect, and it's almost never something you do to them directly. Here's the first thing you need to understand, and it reframes everything else in this conversation. You cannot make a narcissist feel remorse, guilt, or empathetic pain for what they did to you. Not through confrontation, not through evidence, not through a perfectly worded message that finally makes them see it. We've spent this entire series establishing why the psychological structure that allows someone to repeatedly harm people close to them isn't wired to process that kind of pain the way you do. If you're looking for a technique that produces genuine remorse, I have to tell you plainly, it doesn't exist, and searching for it will keep you tethered to them indefinitely. But here's what does exist, and it's real, documented, and psychologically grounded. There is something that reaches this kind of person that genuinely registers as loss, discomfort, even something resembling pain in the limited way they're capable of experiencing it. It's just never what you do to them. It's what happens when you stop being available for anything at all. Remember what we built throughout this entire series. A narcissist's sense of self depends on external supply, attention, admiration, reaction, relevance. This means the single most disruptive thing you can do to that psychological structure isn't an attack. It's disappearance. Genuine, complete, uninterested disappearance. Not the performed kind, not the kind still waiting to be noticed. The real kind, the kind we discussed in a previous conversation, where you stop orbiting them entirely, where your life becomes so full and so genuinely yours that they simply lose their place in it. Here's why this actually functions as something closer to pain than anything confrontational ever could. Confrontation, anger, even visible devastation on your part all still confirm the same thing to them, that they matter, that they still hold power over your emotional state, that the connection, however damaged, still exists. Genuine indifference removes that confirmation entirely. And for a psychological structure that depends on mattering to people, the experience of someone simply, authentically no longer needing them at all is one of the only things that produces real, felt discomfort, because it threatens the actual foundation their sense of self is built on. This is worth sitting with because it's a very different answer than the one you might have been hoping for. You cannot design a message, a moment, or a confrontation that makes them suffer the way you suffered. But you can become someone whose absence they genuinely feel, not because you engineered it as a weapon, but because you built a life so complete that leaving them behind stopped costing you anything at all. Now let's talk about why this matters more than any direct confrontation ever could, and what it actually looks like when someone reaches this place for real. Let's talk about why genuine indifference outperforms every direct confrontation you could ever attempt, because understanding the mechanism clearly is what actually makes this useful rather than just comforting. Here's the first reason. Confrontation gives them something to work with, and indifference gives them nothing. Every time you've tried to make them understand what they did, laying out the evidence, describing the pain in detail, demanding they acknowledge the damage, you handed them material, something to deny, minimize, twist, or turn back around on you. This is exactly why those conversations, no matter how carefully you prepared for them, so often left you feeling worse instead of better, more doubted instead of validated. You walked in seeking acknowledgement and walked out defending yourself instead. That's not a failure of your approach. It's the predictable outcome of engaging directly with a psychological structure built specifically to survive exactly that kind of engagement. Genuine indifference offers nothing to work with at all. There's no comment to twist, no emotion to reframe, no argument to win, because there's no argument happening. This is precisely why it produces something closer to real discomfort than confrontation ever manages to, not because you're trying to hurt them, but because you've removed every tool they've ever relied on to manage and neutralize your reaction. Here's the second reason, and it connects to something we discussed in an earlier conversation about narcissistic supply operating independent of whether the attention is positive or negative. Anger still counts as attention. Grief still counts as attention. Even hatred expressed directly to them still counts as relevance, because it requires you to still be oriented toward them in some way. The only thing that doesn't confirm their continued significance is authentic, uninterested silence, the kind that isn't performed for their benefit, isn't secretly hoping they'll notice, and isn't waiting for a reaction. This is exactly why getting the last word, however satisfying it feels in the moment, rarely produces the lasting effect people hope for. It's still giving them the exact thing their psychological structure depends on: your continued engagement. Now, here's something important to understand about what this actually requires of you, because it's genuinely harder than sending an angry message, and it's worth being honest about that difficulty rather than pretending this path is easy simply because it's more effective. Reaching authentic indifference requires you to do the deepest, slowest, least satisfying in the moment work available. Grieving what happened fully, rebuilding your own sense of reality independent of anything they ever said about you, and constructing a life so genuinely rich and full that there's simply no room left for them in it. This isn't a technique you deploy over a weekend. It's the natural result of real healing, the same healing we've discussed throughout this entire series, releasing the need for their apology, releasing the need for them to understand the cost of what they did, releasing the need for any confirmation from them at all. Here's what makes this genuinely worth pursuing, though. Even knowing how much harder it is than a single satisfying confrontation, everything you do in the name of trying to make them feel your pain directly keeps a channel open between you and them, however thin. Every angry message, every attempt to expose them, every carefully constructed confrontation designed to finally make them understand, all of it requires you to keep showing up in their story, which means some part of your own life is still being spent on them. The path we're actually describing today asks for the opposite. Stop showing up in their story entirely and let your absence do something no message ever could. Here's the honest complication, though, and it's the same one we've named throughout every conversation in this series. You will likely never know if it worked. Authentic disappearance means exactly that. You won't be watching for their reaction, won't have access to whether this registered as loss, discomfort, or nothing at all. For some people, given their level of psychological entrenchment, it may genuinely produce nothing you'd ever recognize as pain, even in the limited sense we've described. This is worth accepting honestly before you commit to this path, rather than being disappointed later by an outcome you were never able to observe in the first place. So if this path doesn't guarantee you'll ever see them hurt, doesn't promise confirmation, doesn't offer the direct satisfaction that a well-aimed confrontation might provide in the moment, why is it still the honest answer to what you were actually looking for when you clicked on this title? Here's the honest answer to that question, and it's the one I actually want you to walk away with today, because it matters more than anything else we've discussed in this entire conversation. You clicked on this title because you wanted them to feel something close to what you felt. That desire is real, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as something you should simply rise above. But here's what I need you to understand clearly. Even in the best possible version of this, the version where genuine indifference actually does register as real discomfort, real loss, something close to what we've been calling pain throughout this conversation, that outcome was never actually going to give you what you were really looking for underneath the desire for revenge. What you were actually looking for was for the injustice to be corrected, for the universe or something like it to balance out what happened, for them to finally carry some portion of the weight you've been carrying alone this entire time. That's not a petty wish. It's one of the most human responses that exists. The same instinct toward fairness that makes children protest, "That's not fair," the moment they're old enough to understand the concept at all. Wanting balance restored after real harm isn't something to be ashamed of. Let's actually sit with this desire for a moment rather than rushing past it toward the reframe, because I think it deserves more honesty than it usually gets in conversations like this one. Wanting someone to suffer for what they did to you doesn't make you a bad person, and it doesn't undo any of the healing work you've done up to this point. It's not a sign that you're stuck or that you haven't grown or that you're somehow less evolved than someone who claims to feel nothing but peaceful detachment toward the person who hurt them. Anyone who tells you that wanting justice is itself a moral failing has usually never actually experienced the specific disorienting unfairness of being deeply harmed by someone who then goes on, seemingly untouched, seemingly unbothered, seemingly rewarded by life anyway. That unfairness is real. It happens constantly in relationships exactly like the one you may have lived through, and pretending otherwise, pretending that karma always eventually delivers a tidy, visible consequence, would be its own kind of dishonesty. Here's the truth this entire series has been building toward across every single conversation we've had: that balance was never actually going to come from them, whether through confrontation, through evidence, through a perfectly executed disappearance, or through any method at all. It was never available on their side of this story, because the same limitation that allowed them to hurt you in the first place is the limitation that prevents them from ever fully carrying the weight of what they did, however you approach it. This isn't a comforting reframe designed to make you feel better about an outcome you can't control. It's simply mechanically true based on everything we've established throughout this entire series about how this particular psychological structure actually functions. This means the actual answer to "how do I make them feel this pain" was never really about them at all, even though the title and your reason for clicking it framed it that way. The real answer is this: you stop needing them to feel it in order to move forward. Not because they deserve that mercy. This isn't about mercy. And it was never about whether they deserve anything. It's because your own healing was never actually supposed to depend on their suffering in order to be complete. Tying your peace to their pain means your peace stays permanently unavailable until a condition outside your control gets met, a condition you may never actually witness from a person who may never actually be capable of fulfilling it. Here's something worth naming directly, because it explains why this particular kind of waiting is so much harder to release than it might initially seem. Wanting them to suffer isn't really at its core about cruelty. It's about wanting confirmation. It's about needing some external, undeniable proof that what happened to you actually mattered, that it registered somewhere as real, that you weren't simply discarded and forgotten while your entire world was rearranged by what they did. This is the same underlying need we discussed in an earlier conversation about apologies. The desire isn't primarily for their suffering as an end in itself. It's for evidence that the harm was real and significant enough to leave a mark somewhere on someone, even if that someone is the very person who caused it. Here's why chasing that confirmation from them specifically will never actually satisfy this need, even in the rare cases where something resembling discomfort does reach them. Confirmation from someone who has already shown you through their entire pattern of behavior that they're unreliable, unstable, and often dishonest about their own internal experience was never going to be trustworthy confirmation in the first place. Even if you somehow witnessed unmistakable evidence that they were struggling, that your absence had genuinely cost them something, some part of you would likely still find a way to doubt it, minimize it, or wonder if it was performed rather than real, because that's exactly the kind of doubt this specific relationship trained you to carry. This means the confirmation you're actually looking for was never going to arrive in a form solid enough to satisfy you, even under the best possible circumstances. So where does that leave the actual need for confirmation, if it can't reliably come from them? Here's what I want you to do with the desire for them to feel it, because pretending it will simply vanish isn't honest either. Let it exist. Feel the full weight of wanting justice you may never get to witness. Grieve, specifically and directly, the fact that they may go through their entire life never truly understanding what they took from you. That grief is valid, and it deserves real space rather than being rushed past in the name of premature enlightenment. Sit with it. Write it down if that helps. Say it out loud to someone who can simply hold it with you rather than trying to immediately fix it or talk you out of feeling it. But alongside that grief, I want you to hold something else, something we've returned to throughout this entire series in different forms. Your life was never supposed to wait for their reckoning in order to begin again. The confirmation you actually need that what happened was real, that it mattered, that you didn't imagine the severity of it, is available to you from sources far more reliable than them. Your own clear memory. The people who witnessed enough of it to validate your experience. Your own settled internal knowledge built slowly over time that no longer requires anyone else's agreement in order to feel solid and true. This confirmation is slower to build than a single satisfying moment of watching them suffer would be, but it's also permanent in a way their reaction, even if you somehow witnessed it, never could be. The most honest, complete answer to the question this title asks is this: if you truly want them to feel the absence of what they lost, the way to get closest to that isn't a message, a confrontation, or a carefully aimed final word. It's becoming someone so genuinely healed, so genuinely full, so thoroughly moved into a life that has nothing to do with them anymore, that your absence from their story becomes the loudest thing you never had to say. And even then, even if you build that life, even if that absence genuinely registers somewhere in them as loss, the actual prize was never their discomfort. It was you, finally, on the other side of all of it, whole, unbothered by whether they ever felt a single thing, living a life so completely your own that the question of what they feel simply stopped being one you needed answered in order to be at peace. That was always the only version of this that was ever actually going to be within your reach. And it was always from the very beginning more than enough.